I believe in everything and nothing at the same time. So if you tell me that those in control created the Grim Reaper so that we fear death, so that we see it as something evil, then I'm gonna look into it. Because how did we go from celebrating death, seeing it as a passage, a return, a continuation, to this guy, the Grim Reaper, a hooded skeleton that hunts you down, weapon in hand, and brings you death as punishment? But that version of death isn't universal. In some parts of the world, death was and still is a celebration, a reunion, a return. So how did the story about death become so twisted? So much so that we needed this guy as a representation of death. So let's take a look back. And the only way to understand it was to see it. Before we had science, before we could explain bacteria, infection, or death, humanity still had to make sense of dying. So death became this guy, the Grim Reaper. But who created this particular character? Who gave him this getup? The cloak, an hourglass, the flipped up hood, the rope for a belt, because I swear I've seen a rope for a belt. And if this whole ensemble wasn't enough, they put it on a skeleton and insisted on arming him with a scythe. So why did humanity choose to make death look so terrifying? An inevitable part of life now looked like something nefarious. In this video, we'll trace the evolution of death itself, from ancient gods who guided souls with compassion to the skeletal figure that became so popular, even cool, that people rushed to have it tattooed on themselves. So let's go back to OG death, way before the Grim Reaper blew up, when different civilizations saw death through different eyes. And maybe by taking a look at how they perceived death, we'll come to understand how we became to fear it. Way before this guy came into play, death didn't seem so scary, so evil, so cruel. It was part of the natural order, a necessary passage from one existence to another. In ancient Egypt, death was guided by Anubis, the god who led souls through the underworld. He was protective about it. He didn't kill, and he wasn't trying to threaten you with sharp objects. Instead, he watched over the deceased and escorted them to their new life. Because back then, death didn't seem as an ending, but more of a journey. In Greek mythology, death had a name, and that was Thanatos. At first, he wasn't seen as evil, but just inevitable. But over time, as stories evolved, like the game of telephone where stories keep morphing, he eventually became something to fear. And not because he was cruel, just because it was something that you couldn't escape. He represented death, something that just had to happen. So it wasn't something that they tried to make scary, it just ended up being scary because it was death. In India, the Hindu god of Yama was fair, balanced, lawful, not evil, definitely not evil. It's important to note that part. When you died, Yama acted as a judge, keeping things orderly, deciding where you go based on your actions in life. So kind of like, you did really well, you go this way. You did not so good things, you go that way. Yama decided your next destination and keeping the cosmic order intact. And even in early Christianity, before the Middle Ages, death was simply seen as the body resting while awaiting resurrection. In every culture, death served as a function, as a transitioning period, and something more meaningful. And it also seems that the more meaning that was given to death, the less people feared it. But somewhere along the way, that meaning was replaced by fear. Then came a complete shift in perspective, especially in the West. While many cultures still saw death as a rebirth or a renewal, Europe's story changed and fear settled in. The Middle Ages brought war and famine, and the church began preaching that death was no longer just a passage. It was a time of judgment. So you didn't simply just die. You faced either eternal reward or eternal punishment. And it was all based on how you lived your life. And then suddenly death wasn't so neutral anymore. It became a test, a moment that would determine your fate for all of eternity. It was almost easy to accept this new perspective of death because life was fragile. And death seemed to be everywhere, and often sudden and unexplained, as if death was chasing you down. And in that instability, the church offered structure to chaos and the hope for life after death. But with that came the idea of death as divine judgment. And with that shift on how people were now viewing death, it set the stage for more haunting creations. So that's where we meet the Grim Reaper. In 1347, ships arrived in Europe carrying a silent killer, the Black Death. Within 4 years, it wiped out nearly half the population. Entire families vanished. Priests died praying. Doctors died healing. No one was spared. Every single person was at risk. The world had never seen death on such a scale, and so they had a hard time accepting it, had a hard time understanding it. No one could make sense of it. People blamed everything, the air, the stars, God's wrath. But deep down, what terrified them the most was that death seemed to walk among them, hiding in corners during the daylight and creeping through the mist at night. So artists became painting murals on church walls, skeletons leading men, women, kings, and peasants to one final dance. This became known as the Dance of Death, and these paintings appeared in France, Germany, and England. And they all had the same message, where death escaped no one. And over time, these skeletons began to merge into one figure, and then they were all cloaked and faceless. And of course, skeletal. A scythe in one hand, an hourglass in the other, and this became the Grim Reaper. And really, he became the first universal image of death in the West. Now, this whole video was spawned by something I had read, and then it sparked a few questions in me one night, where I started thinking, well, who drew that? Why did they choose to make death look like that? And were they okay? Because all the personifications of death that I had seen from way back in the day didn't look as eerie. But it turns out it wasn't one person or one artist. This depiction of death took shape over time. And unlike mythical gods, the Grim Reaper didn't belong to one religion. He was born out of art and our need to make sense of mass trauma. And contrary to what some people might assume, the Grim Reaper wasn't created to scare us into submission or obedience. There's no historical or folklore evidence to support that idea. Instead, this figure emerged as a way for humanity to cope with death and disease, to make sense of it, to give it a face. And so he wasn't a tool of control, but just a symbol of understanding. And as I said before, there isn't a single artist that's credited with creating the Grim Reaper. But medieval painters and illustrators, especially Hans Holbein, helped define how we still picture the Grim Reaper today. Holbein's Dance of Death woodcuts showed death interrupting regular life. And there were so many depictions of this, like a bishop giving a sermon, a merchant counting his coins, a bride walking down the aisle. And according to these woodcuts, death lurked around every corner and touched everyone. So the Reaper's look, the hooded robe, the skeletal face, the hourglass, the scythe, wasn't a new look. So let's go through these symbols so that we understand them better. The scythe came from farming, harvesting crops at their peak. Death reaped lives the same way. The hourglass reminded people that time was running out. The black cloak symbolized the unknown and also made the skeletal figure feel like a shadow itself. And together, these elements formed this idea that death was gonna get everyone. And even the cycle of life and decay, because, well, that's where the skeleton comes from. And that's why the Reaper resonated so sharply, because it didn't come from fantasy, it came from reality, from things people already understood. Now, to be clear, the Grim Reaper evolved. He began simply as skeletons. He wasn't originally the hooded figure with the black cloak and the scythe. That's just the version we're most familiar with today. The Grim Reaper, at its core, has always just been one thing, a representation of death. So when the world was falling apart, people needed to make sense of it. They couldn't see germs or understand infection, but they can at least imagine this presence walking their town. And so by giving death a face, humanity kind of gained control again. If death was a being, then maybe he could be reasoned with. Maybe they could talk to him. Maybe death could be delayed. And so the Reaper made something that was invisible visible. And even though it was terrifying, it was still a little comforting. And probably because he came for everyone, regardless of wealth, class, power. Didn't matter what kind of life you lived in this world, everyone became equal at the end. And so in a strange way, the Grim Reaper brought fairness. And so over the centuries, the Grim Reaper never went away. He never disappeared, and he kind of adapted. In the Renaissance, he appeared in plays and moral lessons. In romantic poetry, he became a poetic dark angel of sorts. And even now in modern times, he appears in movies, TV shows, cartoons. He's on the cover of albums, sometimes as a villain, sometimes as a friend. But no matter the version, he still embodies that ancient truth that death isn't complete chaos. It's the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. And so from these symbols of death to the Grim Reaper, humanity has always needed to see death to understand life, to understand what this all is. Now, did any of these images actually help humanity cope with life and understand death? Did they help us manage fear while facing death? I guess that's the part we'll never know. You would think that some of the softer depictions of death would help at least neutralize that fear. Because even though the Grim Reaper isn't a universal symbol of death, he was certainly a mirror of what humanity was facing at that time, what life was like during the time of his creation and how it evolved. But these days, even though he still represents death, he's definitely less feared and sometimes even seen as a homie of sorts. Because he's everywhere, on t-shirts, jackets, cool art, and as I said before, even as tattoos. He's definitely not what he was born from, which was famine and disease, because those cords have been long cut. So personally, I don't believe life is the end. And even though there are some scientists that will say that they have evidence that we just stop existing after death, I choose to believe that we transition into something bigger, better, something with more meaning. And not at all what the Grim Reaper represented at his inception. I also believe that on some level, we subconsciously believe that we go somewhere after death. Probably something bigger, something better, a transition into a different life. Otherwise, we wouldn't see the Grim Reaper as something cool, because we definitely see him as something cool. We don't think that he's chasing us down with this scythe, like, I'm gonna get you. So there you have it, the birth of the Grim Reaper. So if you found this video interesting, be sure to check out my next one where we'll explore more fascinating things that make you ask a zillion questions.